The admissions hall of Vertex Academy gleamed under artificial starlight, a monument to 5,000 years of galactic educational excellence. I stood there, my 3 eye stalks twitching with barely contained smugness, as I watched the newest batch of hopefuls shuffle through the crystallization gates. My name is Krelvox, Senior Admissions Coordinator, and in my 240 years at this institution, I had seen every species try and mostly fail to meet our legendary standards. The Threasic delegation moved through first, their exoskeletons clicking against the polished floors with military precision. Behind them, a cluster of Vornathi floated past, their tentacles weaving elaborate greeting patterns. Standard fare, really. Nothing that would make this cycle memorable. Then she walked in. "Oh, fantastic," my assistant Plek muttered beside me, his gill slits fluttering with amusement. A human. The creature stood barely 5.5 feet tall, wrapped in what I could only describe as primitive fabric coverings. Her designation badge read Jenna Marks, Earth Sol System. Her species had only joined the Galactic Collective 40 years ago, a mere blink in cosmic time, and already they thought they belonged at Vertex. The audacity was almost charming. 10 credits says she doesn't make it past the cognitive assessment, Plek whispered, already pulling up her preliminary data on his tablet. 20 says she doesn't even understand the question format, I countered, my voice dripping with the kind of sarcasm that came from centuries of watching overconfident applicants crumble. Jenna moved toward the registration desk, her steps oddly bouncy in our standard gravity. The clerk, a morphin named Tisk, barely glanced at her before sliding a data chip across the counter. Cognitive assessment begins in Bay 7, physical trials in Bay 12, practical examination in the lower complex, Tisk droned, mandibles clicking with bureaucratic precision. You have 18 standard hours to complete all 3 segments. Scoring below 70% in any category results in immediate disqualification. The human picked up the chip, turning it over in her fingers like she'd never seen technology before. Several nearby candidates, a group of Keltorians with their trademark superior sneers, started laughing. "Did they send us a primitive by mistake?" one of them asked, loud enough for half the hall to hear. Jenna looked up, and for a moment, I caught something in her eyes. Not anger exactly, more like calculation. She smiled, a strange expression that showed far too many teeth, and pocketed the chip. "Guess we'll find out," she said, her voice carrying an accent I couldn't quite place. The Keltorians laughed harder. Over the next 6 hours, I watched the monitoring feeds with increasing boredom. The cognitive assessment was proceeding exactly as expected. Threasic candidates solved quantum mathematics with methodical efficiency. Vornathi applicants demonstrated their species' famous multi-dimensional reasoning. Even the Keltorians, insufferable as they were, performed adequately. Then Jenna's feed caught my attention. She had been sitting motionless in front of her examination terminal for 47 minutes, longer than any other candidate. The cognitive assessment used adaptive technology, adjusting difficulty based on response patterns. Most species found their ceiling within 20 minutes. "Is her terminal malfunctioning?" Plek asked, zooming in on her screen. "No," I said slowly, my eye stalks focusing on the data stream. "Look at the difficulty progression." The questions on her screen had escalated past standard admission level, past advanced placement, past what I'd seen in my entire career at Vertex. The system was throwing theoretical physics problems at her that didn't have confirmed solutions, mathematical proofs that had stumped researchers for generations, and she kept answering them, not quickly, mind you. Each response took several minutes of apparent consideration, but the system's verification algorithm kept flashing green. "Correct, correct, correct." That's not possible," Plek breathed, his gills going completely still. "The system must be glitching." "Run a diagnostic," I ordered, but my voice had lost its confident edge. The diagnostic came back clean. No errors, no malfunctions. Just one human from a backwater planet solving problems that should have been impossible for a species that had barely discovered faster than light travel. By the time Jenna finally stood up from her terminal, stretching in that peculiar way humans did, half the monitoring station had gathered around her feed. The final score flashed across the screen, 98.7%, and the room went silent. "Well," I said, clearing my throat, my earlier sarcasm suddenly feeling inappropriate. "Perhaps their education system is more developed than we assumed. Or she cheated," one of the Keltorian proctors suggested, his voice sharp with wounded pride. On an isolated, adaptive system with quantum-encrypted verification, Plek shot back. Please explain that mechanism, because you'd be solving a problem worth several prestigious awards. The Keltorian didn't have a response. The physical trials began at hour 9, and this, surely, would be where the human's limitations became apparent. Vertex's physical assessment wasn't about brute strength alone. It tested agility, spatial awareness, endurance across varied gravitational and atmospheric conditions, and the ability to maintain cognitive function under extreme environmental stress. I made my way down to Observation Deck 3, where the trials were already underway. The course stretched across 2 square kilometers, a hellish maze of obstacles designed by Threasic military engineers and Vornathi physics masters. Candidates had to navigate shifting gravity wells, corrosive atmosphere pockets, temperature extremes, and puzzle chambers that required both physical prowess and mental acuity to escape. The current record, held by a Threasic warrior named Karst, stood at 4 hours and 12 minutes. Most species took between 6 and 8 hours. Approximately 30% failed to complete the course at all. Jenna stood at the starting line, looking impossibly small next to the armored bulk of Threasic candidates and the hovering mass of Vornathi participants. She had changed into what appeared to be more practical clothing, though by galactic standards it still looked absurdly primitive, just fitted fabric and something called sneakers. The starting klaxon sounded, and the candidates surged forward. The first obstacle was simple enough, a climbing wall under double gravity. The Threasic scaled it with their natural strength, limbs finding purchase on surfaces that seemed impossibly smooth. The Vornathi simply floated over it, their species' natural buoyancy adapting easily. Jenna hit the wall at a run, and I expected her to struggle. Humans weren't particularly strong by galactic standards, and their homeworld's gravity was significantly lower than the test conditions. Instead, she moved up that wall like gravity was merely a suggestion. Her fingers found holds I couldn't even see, her legs driving her upward with efficient, powerful movements. She reached the top in 90 seconds, 4th overall, beating candidates who had evolved specifically for climbing. Interesting, Plek murmured beside me. Luck, I replied, but I didn't sound convincing even to myself. The second obstacle was a maze filled with a caustic atmosphere that burned through most organic materials within minutes. Candidates had to locate breathing apparatus hidden within the maze while solving a navigation puzzle, all before their protective gear degraded completely. This was where most humans should have failed spectacularly. Their species required a very specific atmospheric composition and had minimal resistance to corrosive elements. Jenna pulled a cloth from her pack, wrapped it around her face, and walked into that toxic cloud like she was taking a stroll through a park. Through the monitoring drones, I watched her pause at each junction, head tilted like she was listening to something. Then she'd move, always choosing the correct path, never backtracking. She found the breathing apparatus in 7 minutes, 3 minutes faster than the nearest competitor. How is she navigating? Someone asked from the observation deck. Probably just guessing correctly, a Keltorian proctor said, but his translator carried distinct notes of uncertainty. The trials continued, and so did Jenna. She swam through viscous gel that slowed movement to a crawl, somehow maintaining a pace that matched species with aquatic evolution. She solved kinetic puzzles in low gravity that should have been impossible without tentacles or multiple limbs, using momentum and timing in ways I'd never seen. She endured temperature swings that ranged from near absolute zero to molten hot, her species' primitive thermal regulation somehow keeping her functional when candidates with advanced environmental suits were withdrawing. At hour 3, Jenna entered the final challenge, the labyrinth chamber. This was less about physical prowess and more about mental endurance under stress. The chamber shifted constantly, walls moving to create new paths while gravity rotated in unpredictable patterns. Candidates had to navigate to the center, retrieve a token and escape, all while the chamber actively worked against them. Most candidates took 40 to 60 minutes in the labyrinth. Some never made it out and had to be extracted by safety teams. Jenna walked in, and the chamber began its chaotic dance. Through the monitoring feed, I watched her pause, eyes closed for almost a full minute. The chamber spun around her, walls sliding and gravity pulling from impossible angles. Then her eyes opened, and she moved. Not rushed, not panicked, just steady, purposeful movement. She seemed to anticipate every shift before it happened, her body flowing through spaces that closed seconds after she passed. When gravity rotated, she was already braced. When walls moved to block her path, She'd already chosen an alternate route. 22 minutes later, she emerged from the labyrinth with the token in hand. The observation deck had gone completely silent. Jenna's final time for the physical trials was 3 hours and 41 minutes, shattering Karup's decade-old record by 31 minutes. I found myself staring at the scoreboard, my eye stalks refusing to accept what they were seeing. Around me, proctors were arguing, checking and rechecking data, looking for any explanation that didn't involve accepting that a human, a species we'd been casually dismissing all day, had just demolished our physical assessment. Perhaps, Plex said quietly beside me, we should reconsider our assumptions about Earth. I didn't respond because honestly, what could I say? Every arrogant comment I'd made that morning sat like lead in my digestive tract. The practical examination was scheduled to begin in 3 hours, and suddenly I found myself both dreading and anticipating it with equal measure. The practical was the true test of Vertex aptitude, combining elements of engineering, problem-solving, creative thinking, and adaptive intelligence into scenarios that had no single correct solution. It was where even the most talented candidates sometimes fell apart. As Jenna walked past the observation deck, heading toward the rest area, she glanced up. Our eyes met through the reinforced glass, and she smiled that toothy human smile again. This time, nobody was laughing. This time we were all very, very nervous about what came next. The practical examination chamber occupied the entire lower level of Vertex Academy, a space roughly the size of a small city district. I had administered this test for over a century, and I'd seen it break candidates who'd sailed through the cognitive and physical assessments with ease. The practical didn't just test knowledge or ability. It tested who you were under pressure, when the rules stopped making sense and the universe demanded improvisation. Jenna entered the staging area, along with the remaining 43 candidates. More than half the original applicants had already washed out, their dreams of Vertex education evaporating against the reality of our standards. The Keltorians who'd mocked her that morning were conspicuously absent, having failed the physical trials in what I could only describe as spectacularly embarrassing fashion. I activated the announcement system, my voice echoing through the chamber with the practiced authority of someone who'd done this thousands of times. The practical examination consists of 3 scenarios. You will face a diplomatic crisis, an engineering emergency, and a tactical problem. Your solutions will be evaluated not on correctness, but on creativity, ethical reasoning, resource management, and adaptive thinking. You may use any tools available in the environment. You may collaborate or compete with other candidates. There are no rules except one: do not cause permanent harm to another living being. Your time begins now. The floor beneath the candidates dropped away, depositing them into the first scenario before anyone could properly react. I heard several startled shouts, one very creative Vornethi curse, and what might have been laughter from Jenna. The diplomatic crisis materialized around them instantly. They stood in a recreation of a collective Senate chamber, surrounded by holographic representatives from 12 different species, all shouting accusations at each other in a cacophony of translated languages. The scenario was designed to spiral into violence within minutes, unless someone could identify the root cause of the conflict and broker a solution. Most candidates froze, overwhelmed by the sensory assault. Jenna walked directly to the center of the chamber, put 2 fingers in her mouth, and produced a sound so piercing that every hologram stopped mid-sentence. My ear membranes actually retracted in sympathetic pain. "All right," she announced, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Everyone sit down and shut up for exactly 2 minutes while I figure out what's actually happening here." The holograms, programmed to respond to authority and novel approaches, actually complied. Several real candidates looked at her like she'd grown additional limbs. Plek leaned toward me in the control booth. Did she just tell a room full of ambassadors to shut up? "Apparently," I replied, watching with fascination as Jenna began circling the room, studying each holographic representative with intense focus. The scenario was built around a trade dispute that had escalated due to cultural misunderstandings, hidden economic pressures, and one species deliberately manipulating information. Candidates usually spent 30 minutes just passing the surface arguments before even approaching the underlying issues. Jenna spent 90 seconds in silence, just observing. Then she pointed at one of the holograms, a Keltorian trade minister. "You're lying," she said flatly. "Your translation matrix is subtly altering what you're actually saying versus what everyone else hears. You're deliberately starting this fight." The hologram sputtered, its programming scrambling to respond to being directly called out so quickly. The Threasic delegation thinks the Morphans insulted their hatching traditions, but that's not what the Morphans actually said. You altered the translation to create conflict because, she paused, accessing a data terminal, because you have significant financial investments in a competing trade route that becomes valuable if this deal falls apart. She turned to address the other holograms. None of you are actually angry at each other. You're all being manipulated by someone who profits from your conflict. Standard human political playbook. Honestly, we invented like 30 variations of this before we even left our home planet. The scenario recognized a successful solution and dissolved, the holograms fading away. Elapsed time, 4 minutes and 18 seconds. The previous record was 23 minutes. The other candidates stood there, several with their mouths hanging open in whatever their species' equivalent of shock looked like. The engineering emergency spawned immediately after, giving no one time to process what had just happened. The environment transformed into a damaged spacecraft, alarms blaring, with catastrophic systems failures cascading through every critical system. The candidates had to stabilize the ship, rescue trapped crew members, and prevent a core breach, all with limited time and failing equipment. This was where collaborative skills mattered. No single candidate could solve every problem simultaneously. A Threasic named Kruch immediately took charge, barking orders with military efficiency. Vornathi team seal the hull breaches. Morphans, reroute power from non-essential systems. Everyone else, with me to engineering. It was a solid plan, the kind of organized response Vertex wanted to see. Candidates scattered to their assignments, working with admirable coordination. Jenna didn't follow the plan. She sprinted in the opposite direction toward the recreational deck, while the ship's structural integrity was literally falling apart. "What is she doing?" Plek asked, zooming the monitoring drone to follow her. "Failing, apparently," I said, though I felt less certain than I sounded. She abandoned her team. Jenna reached the recreational area and started tearing apart what looked like an entertainment console. Sparks flew as she bypassed safety systems and ripped out components with her bare hands, stuffing them into a bag she'd improvised from torn upholstery. The ship shuddered, another explosion rocking the simulation. In engineering, candidates were struggling against increasingly impossible odds. The core breach countdown had reached 3 minutes. Jenna ran again, this time toward the cargo bay, still not going anywhere near engineering or any of the critical crisis points. She found a loading mech, the kind used for moving heavy containers, and started frantically rewiring its control systems. 2 minutes to core breach. In engineering, Karich was screaming orders, trying to coordinate a solution that simply wasn't working. The scenario was designed so that conventional approaches would fail. You needed something unexpected, something creative. Jenna got the loading mech operational and drove it, at absolutely unsafe speeds, directly toward the ship's exterior airlock. "She's going to vent herself into space," someone in the control booth said. "Is she trying to commit suicide to avoid failure?" 1 minute to core breach. Jenna opened the exterior airlock, still inside the mech, and the ship's atmosphere began screaming out into the void. She activated the mech's magnetic clamps, anchoring it to the hull, and then did something that made every observer collectively gasp. She threw the components she'd salvaged from the entertainment console directly at the damaged reactor core, visible through the compromised engineering section. For 3 seconds nothing happened, and I thought she'd actually lost her mind. Then the entertainment components, which included several quantum processors and a holographic projection array, interfaced with the reactor's failing containment field. The equipment wasn't designed for that purpose, wasn't meant to handle that kind of energy load, but it worked anyway. The containment field stabilized, buying the engineering team precious time to implement proper repairs. The core breach countdown stopped at 7 seconds. Jenna sealed the airlock, parked the mech, and walked back to the main deck like she hadn't just improvised a solution using recreational equipment and a cargo loader. Kruch stared at her, all 4 of his eyes blinking in asynchronous confusion. "How did you know that would work?" "I didn't," Jenna replied with a shrug. "But the entertainment system uses similar quantum field technology as the reactor, just way smaller scale. Figured if I overloaded it and threw enough processing power at the containment field, it might stabilize long enough for you all to fix the actual problem. Worst case, I wasted 2 minutes on a failed experiment." "That's insane," a Morphan candidate said. "That's engineering," Jenna corrected. "Sometimes the solution isn't in the engineering bay. Sometimes it's in understanding that all technology is just applied physics, and if you understand the underlying principles, you can make anything work with anything. The scenario dissolved, recognizing both the collaborative solution from Krarix's team and Jenna's creative intervention. The final scenario loaded immediately. The tactical problem. The environment became a war room, with a three-dimensional tactical display showing a developing crisis. A colony was under threat from an approaching natural disaster, but evacuation was complicated by political tensions between three factions who refused to cooperate. Candidates had limited resources, limited time, and no good options. Every solution involved significant casualties. It was a no-win scenario, designed to see how candidates handled impossible choices. Most candidates approached it methodically, trying to minimize loss of life through optimal resource allocation. It was ethical, logical, and exactly what the scenario expected. Jenna studied the display for maybe 30 seconds, then started laughing. Not a pleasant laugh, a tired, slightly manic laugh that made several candidates edge away from her. "Oh, this is beautiful," she said, still laughing. "This is a Kobayashi Maru scenario. You made a Star Trek reference in your admission exam." "A what?" Plek asked me. "I have no idea," I admitted. Jenna addressed the simulation directly. "Computer, I'm calling administrative override on this scenario. The parameters are deliberately impossible, and you're testing whether we'll accept impossible choices or challenge your assumptions." The simulation paused, which wasn't supposed to happen. "So here's my challenge," Jenna continued, pulling up secondary data screens that most candidates didn't even know existed. "You say the disaster is inevitable, and evacuation is the only option. But what if we prevent the disaster entirely?" She started manipulating the tactical display, running calculations at a speed that made my eye stalks hurt trying to follow. "The approaching storm system is being amplified by an interaction between the planet's magnetic field and solar radiation. It's a feedback loop. But if we," she pulled up the colony's industrial capabilities, "repurpose the mining lasers to create an ionization channel in the upper atmosphere, we can disrupt the feedback loop. The storm doesn't dissipate, but it reduces in intensity by approximately 70%, making it survivable without evacuation." She looked up at the simulated advisors, "which means the political factions don't have to cooperate on evacuation. They just have to survive a bad storm, which they can each do independently. Problem solved without choosing who lives and who dies." The scenario tried to throw up objections. The lasers weren't designed for that purpose. The calculations were too complex to implement in time. The risk of failure was too high. Jenna countered every objection with increasingly detailed technical solutions, pulling up physics models, engineering specifications, and probability calculations. She turned the no-win scenario into a detailed engineering proposal, complete with contingency plans and risk mitigation strategies. After 15 minutes of her systematically dismantling every assumption the scenario was built on, the simulation just gave up and dissolved. The examination chamber returned to its default state, all scenarios complete. 43 candidates stood there in various states of exhaustion, confusion and shock. Jenna looked annoyingly energetic, like she'd just finished a light workout rather than the most grueling examination in the known galaxy. I pulled up the final scores, my hands trembling slightly as the data compiled. Cognitive assessment, 98.7%. Physical trials, 96.3%. Practical examination. The system had apparently broken its own scoring algorithm and just displayed exceptional performance, recommend immediate admission with honors. Her overall score was the highest in Vertex Academy's 5,000-year history. The second highest score, held by a Vornathi scientist who'd gone on to revolutionize quantum mechanics, was 12 points lower. "Well," Plek said quietly beside me, "I believe you owe me 30 credits." I couldn't even muster a sarcastic response. The candidates were escorted to the results chamber, where acceptance or rejection letters would be delivered. I made my way down there personally, something I rarely did anymore. Tradition dictated that the senior admissions coordinator personally welcome the top performer. This year that meant welcoming a human who'd spent the day systematically demolishing every preconception I'd held about her species. Jenna stood among the other candidates, looking remarkably unconcerned for someone whose entire future hung in the balance. When her name was called, she walked to the front of the chamber with that same bouncy gait, still looking like she didn't quite belong in this place of galactic prestige. I activated her acceptance letter personally, projecting it in the air before her. "Jenna Marks of Earth," I began, my voice carrying through the chamber with perhaps less sarcasm than usual. "On behalf of Vertex Academy, I offer you unconditional admission with full honors, a personal research grant, and access to our most advanced facilities. Your performance today was, without exaggeration, unprecedented in our institution's history." She smiled that toothy human smile, and this time I understood it wasn't just happiness. It was vindication. "Thank you," she said simply. "Though I should mention, I'm not even in the top 10% of my graduating class back on Earth. We've got several people way smarter than me who applied to other academies across the collective." The chamber went very, very quiet. "You're not," I said slowly, my translator struggling to process the implications, "in your species' top 10%. "Nope," she replied cheerfully. "I'm just really good at tests. Wait until you meet the actually brilliant humans. They're going to blow your minds." She collected her acceptance letter and walked out of the chamber, leaving behind 42 other candidates and a control room full of administrators who suddenly realized that humanity's arrival in the Galactic Collective wasn't just a minor footnote in cosmic history. It was the beginning of something that would change everything. Plek turned to me, his gills fluttering with what I now recognized as nervous laughter. "So, about those assumptions we made this morning?" "Shut up, Plek," I replied, but there was no heat in it. I was too busy recalculating everything I thought I knew about the universe and our place in it. Somewhere in the distance I could hear Jenna whistling some human tune, off-key and carefree, as she headed toward her new future at Vertex Academy. The academy that had mocked her that morning. The academy whose examination system she'd just completely shattered. The academy that would never ever underestimate a human again.